So, come in and join us on TheDustyFeet.com because this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings, they may be challenged, divine misunderstandings, they may exist, and traditional teachings, they just might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So, feel free to journey around the space. Explore. We have many different topics for discussion. Outside the class, Sons of the Father, the Bible Project, Aleph Beta, Follow the Red String, and more. Lend your ear and then lend your voice. Join a conversation. Start a conversation. Ask questions. Because on this journey, you're probably around folks that just might be pondering the same thing. Community that can build and connect. So come in and join us. And welcome to The Dusty Feet. Good evening. It's June 1st, 2023, and another one of our special series, The Sons of the Father. We're continuing our discussions on The Chosen, created by Jenkins, and we'll be talking about Season 2, Episode 3, Matthew 4:24. During these discussions, my dad, John Wern, my brother Jim Wern, and myself, we're going to be chatting about things that have resonated with us along this journey. So, welcome to The Sons of the Father. In the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here in the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. And remember, on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon if you want a reminder. And here we are, the Sons of the Father. So again,
And I'm the father.
reference up front. Sometimes issues can arise from discussions like these and the assumptions that we have on others listening. It is always unintentional. But if you don't understand or have questions concerning something that we've discussed, please feel free to leave a comment and we will respond as best we can. Or you can always just send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. Sometimes it's just a more private way to ask questions. Okay, so I want to start by reading Matthew 4:23 through 25, just to make sure we're clear about the setting. We're talking about setting coming up on our other series. Matthew 4:23 through 25. So Jesus was going throughout all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, healing every kind of disease, every kind of sickness among the people. The news about him spread throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, those suffering with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. Large crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis, and Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. That sets us up for Matthew 4:24. Interesting. So, that said, gents, what's Daddy-O, what are your thoughts?
Well, you just set the stage because you said that they came there, and in the episode itself, they comment on Philip was talking with little James, and they were talking, or no, Andrew, I think it was. No, it was Philip. Anyway, they were talking about would they be following him if he didn't heal them? And
Hmm.
that's a question that I've had myself for years. That why they're only following him, and as soon as they got healed, of course they were elated and grateful and thankful, and might have followed him for a few more days. But for the majority of them, it would probably wear off. um, I can equate just a tiny bit to when I was involved with Johnny and Friends, and we were distributing wheelchairs, and it had uh, the people, of course, were all over us, and even but when we came back the next year, uh, there was nobody around,
Hmm.
and um, that fascinated me to a degree, uh, because of that. They were thankful, but after a while they forgot, and they weren't uh, really interested in following us around. But uh, the so my question, uh, it wasn't really a question. It was just an observation that uh, that's a question that I asked. And here he is, and they're talking about the same thing, and the people are lined up forever down there. And why wouldn't they be? But the disciples were not happy about this. They were asking question after question after why we could have done this tomorrow. We could have rested, and but not Jesus. He healed the whoever was in the line, but the next day they would leave. What about the next group of people? He didn't heal everybody,
Yeah.
but he healed everybody that was in line that night. And then the picture of him coming back from that totally exhausted, and just walked right past him. And what are they doing? They're arguing about Matthew. He's first they're complaining about the people in the long line, and now they're, what about you? You never apologize. Things
Hmm.
that they brought up was all about them. They weren't thinking of what Jesus was doing and the impact he was having on the people. So I've got some more thoughts, but I want to hear what you guys have to say too.
Okay, James, I have a couple things. So go ahead. Shoot.
I think for me, this one, it's like what you see in Matthew 4:24 is just this expansion of what Jesus is doing. It's a larger area. He's touching more places, different kinds of places, and you see this enlargement of his ministry. And I think that's beginning to the disciples are beginning to feel it. I mean, was it Peter? I forget who said it. It says, "What are we a part of?" All of a sudden, this is bigger than I think we expected it would be. Um, and you also see in this episode, I noticed there was more theology that came out. They began to talk about the theology of healing. There are questions about, what is this healing going on, and would these people believe if they weren't healed, kind of stuff, and happiness, what really makes them happy, self
Mm.
worth. They talked about Jesus's birth. Mary was sharing some of her experience on it, and so we start seeing kind of uh, an increasing depth to what Jesus is doing, not only amongst the disciples, but even touching a larger group of people. And then it also kind of the whole issue of the Jews were looking for this warrior king, and he
Mm.
wasn't that. Even earlier this week, was doing a study in John, and I was getting a little critical. Not critical. I was getting a little sympathetic of the Jewish people, saying, "Man, they really thought he was going to be somebody different." And then as I'm reading through John, and John is explaining to them all of the scriptures that said exactly who Jesus was going to be, the Messiah, the suffering servant, the one who would die. And it's like they just didn't want to see that. And I heard a quote, and I can't remember it. It was a Jewish rabbi, I believe, that said it, as we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are.
Mm.
And basically, it's that whole we see things as what we think they should be. And Jesus is kind of blowing their minds as to what they thought reality would be. And this was one of those episodes that it just kind of boom, exploded, even to the end. Like you said, Dad, when Jesus came in just thoroughly exhausted, and all of them are arguing about the stupidest stuff. And they realize, wow, we got it all wrong here.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
Mary said it right, but we'll expand that later. Bob, how about you?
Yeah. So you bring up a couple of good points, and that's um, the healing part. Um, Interesting, Daddy-O. I'll challenge them. Is that when you're bringing your you're benefiting them by bringing them wheelchairs. You're not healing them.
Mm-hmm.
They leave with the same ailment, and when they leave, you gave them the wheelchair, but in 6 months, is it still working? Okay. That's an element, right, in part of this. So somebody is not going and claiming, and understand that somebody gets a wheelchair that doesn't motivate somebody else to want to go. Okay. Per se, when if that's the motivation. Okay. But we have healings. So is that the motivation to go? And that is one of the arguments, you're right, that they have brought up during this episode, that they're challenged with this. Um, they're at a point where they understand. They have, Jim, what you were saying. They only know what they know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so it's a mixture. It's a mixture of, the Pharisees are have the preponderance of weight put on them because they actually have the scrolls.
Right.
Okay. So they're in possession of the scrolls. You can't tell somebody to go home and read your own Bible or read
Hmm.
your own scroll. They don't exist. So these people only have what's shared to them, the stories that are shared to them. And all the disciples, every single one, because I'll make a point to you said about John. Okay. All the gospels, all of them are hindsight
Hmm.
discussions. So what they're going to do is, in the midst of, especially John is notorious for this. In the midst of something, then he brings up things that continue to point. But was that brought up at the time? Those are things you don't know. We know when we get the sharing that we have that's common amongst the various gospels on various stories. Okay, like for instance, the with Matthew, with Nicodemus, it's only in Matthew. Okay, so not everything's in all. So the ones that have the layover, we don't get that story at all. We get what Jesus has said, and we get their impression of what Jesus said, if that's fair, because sometimes the verbiage is a little different, or the amount of detail that they cover is a bit different. Um, so they only know what they know, and they expect, and that's one of the discussions that they have, is they're going, why don't we just we can heal any time. They even mention that they can do it any time. They want Rome gone. When is that going to happen? That came up in a couple different conversations, a couple different ways, right? um
Yep.
it's only Philip and Matthew that are still focused on trying to learn, right? Matthew's the one trying to understand Torah because he wasn't raised in it. He wasn't a regular synagogue. He was raised as a child. He knew of it, but still at childlike level, and he could read, but he didn't understand. Now you have Mary and Rama, and they can't. Mary can read. Rama can't read. Mary has a different. She has what appears in the movie to be insight. Okay, but she has to share that. So there's all this bouncing around of learning, and where do we need to dig in first? That kind of thing. And so you're right. In our church today, you can't tell somebody, well, go to Matthew, which is, I don't think it's a safe place to start, but we're going to use that as go to Matthew. There is no such thing. So them is Torah, and they keep talking about it, right? So it's messy. This is a messy episode with messy story, including who the Messiah is and their expectations. So with that and the messiness of going on in their discussions, so Dad, what other parts in the discussions that they had between the different disciples that bounced out to you?
Well, I think your term messy was spot on, and the Mary and Rama were kind of standing back just because they have in that time women weren't taught anything about Torah or God or anything. So they were coming in from a listening, trying to understand what the guys were talking about. And the a couple of things. What Mary said, a statement that just really impacted me. Said, "I don't think he wanted us to be holy," because they were talking about that. Said we couldn't be holy without him because did he call us because we were holy, and they knew that wasn't true. So I thought that was kind of kind of brought it back to where we are today. We can't be holy without him. It's turning our lives over to him. Um, it's they were talking about the apostles were talking about being amazed that they were chosen, and I think that's what all led up to what Mary had to say. And then James's conversation with Thomas about being healed. And Thomas said, if that was me, I'd demand it. And Thomas was afraid if he got in line to get healed, and he just wasn't comfortable with pressuring Jesus with that. And going back to what we talked about, just about giving out the wheelchairs, the giving the wheelchairs was really an acknowledgement of these people's value, because in their societies they were like lepers. They were the lowest of the low. And to have somebody come in and make a fuss over them and give them something of such value. Yes, you're right. In some of those instances, those chairs would not be working in a year. Other ones there that were used in homes or kept on. But again, it was the value of the individual
Mhm.
that that we were focused on
Mhm.
doing.
Mhm.
And what was oh, I like the conversation about unlimited money when they talked about what would you do if you had your mother and I drove to San Diego for a time away, and the whole way down, that's all we talked about. What if we had unlimited money? What would we do? never came, because every time that you talked about it and got a figure, you were talking about, would you focus on you or would you focus on others?
Hmm.
And all of that and what is on limited money?
Hmm.
It and they were running into the same thing, and I just thought that was, but it shows where they were at. They're still questioning everything, like you guys have said. They just don't know what's going on because everything's going against what it. Thomas talked about Zechariah and quoted it, and all of that. That's still what they had in their mind.
Hmm.
Big James, when do I whip the sword out? When do we fight? That's what they were trying to figure out. It's great that he's healing, but when are we going to flip Rome where we can really move forward?
Hmm.
All right, I'm rattling on now.
Yeah. Okay, James. What?
James the Lesser, is that me?
James.
Uh, uh, the thing that struck me in their conversations is they're still looking at an external kingdom. And what Jesus was building was an internal kingdom, and trying to help them understand that you're looking at the enemy who's on the outside. And yeah, we can destroy Rome, but then the next country is going to come along and you're going to have continual external enemies that you will never get rid of. But if you look at the kingdom as internal and what that looks like and what those victories look like, and who reigns there, it doesn't matter who's on the outside. It doesn't matter at all. And it's hard to hear that when you're in an oppressive situation. It's easier to see it, here in America, we're relatively free. Um, we can say that. If I was living in China, that might be a little bit harder. If I was living in Russia, that might be a little bit harder, or in the Middle East or something like that. But seeing what Jesus was doing to try to shift their focus, to what was going on in the kingdom inside. When he originally talked to uh, Nicodemus, and he said, "You have to be born again, something from the inside out." And Nikki's looking at the outside. How can I get back in my mother's womb? That doesn't work, And Jesus said, "No, you don't understand." Um, and it takes time. And fortunately, Jesus had the grace to give them the freedom to question and to bicker and to work through all of it. And I'm grateful that he gives me the same grace to argue and fight and wrestle and run and come back to where
Yeah.
he's at.
Yeah. What? Yeah. We now, right? We have this point. I brought this up before that you have Malachi, right? We get
Mhm.
the end. It's 400 years till you
Mhm.
get to Jesus, right? You get it's about 200 years ish from when Greek thought Hellenism starts to really take its hold on a
Mhm.
broader scale than just there because that kingdom was
Right.
huge. Okay. But a lot of that thinking rolls over into Rome, which where
Mhm.
they're sitting. Okay. So you're right. They're under oppression, they're under Rome, they get this peace. But scripturally, they're still looking for doing this. Now, we now are post Jesus,
Right.
2,000 years.
Mhm.
We are asking and expecting and asking the same questions, bringing up the same doggone points that these guys are in this, right?
Mhm.
And there wasn't a thing about an internal anything. What they want is if Jesus is in charge, if we think we understand the things that point to the end of the book, okay, of which I'm still not convinced of that, but let's just say we get there, is that Jesus is in charge. So that internal kingdom, that's they're thinking, who cares? Because
Mhm.
I have an external king, right? And they want the king. I don't think they know what they're asking for.
Mm-mm.
That's a whole nother question that I would love to go on sometime and chat about. But they are wrapped up in that moment of
Yeah.
there, and they want the kingdom. And you're right, they're tired of oppression.
Hmm.
Where James brings up the point, he says, saying that he thought about the Messiah at least once a week and hoped that it would at least get to see him. Do you realize post Jesus, right? From all of the disciples, right, and Paul, every single one of them expected Jesus to come back in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Every single one.
Yeah.
So even after he died and rose, which we've just celebrated, just the timing of this particular piece, and in that excitement of this, it's that the turn was automatically their shift, even though they were acknowledging this part, their shift mentally was still that he's coming back and
Yeah.
all of this is going to change.
Yep.
And it never did. And it hasn't, meaning we're 2,000 years later waiting for the same thing. So I get their thought process. I get their frustration. I also understand the yearning they have for it, that everybody said, you know, next, next,
Yeah.
next. And we're sitting here. Um, there's just it's a messy part to throw them under the bus per se, and that on the Dusty we talk about this all the time. That we won't hold ourselves up to that same mirror,
Yeah.
and we're hypocritical at that's a kind word to say,
Yeah.
of how we manage those pieces. Um,
Question, Bob, real quick, and you
Shoot.
you may know this answer, you may not. I don't know. Um, so in the church today, in Protestant Christianity, pastors have a lot of liberty on what they preach. They can take a scripture, they can go expositionally. My daughter's church right now, they're going through the book of Matthew. They've been going through the book of Matthew for over a year.
Mhm.
So you got those expository verse by verse or word by word in this case.
Yeah.
Um, or you have guys that'll do it topically and they can emphasize different things. And that's why you've
Mhm.
got the peace, prosperity, gospel kinds of churches and everything that's going on.
Right.
In Jewish synagogues, did the rabbis have as much liberty to interpret scripture their way, or was there pretty much a set structure with some flexibility?
Now, actually, very good question. And so you have, for instance, we have at this time the two major power players that are
Hmm.
here. The two big boys are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So you have Pharisaic thought and Sadduceic thought. Okay. Now we have this point because I just covered this on a outside the class.
Hmm.
Um, so people are go back and check the outside the class episode, because um, what they have is those two frames. They're the power players, and the crowd understands. Not just guys. The crowd split. It says, and the crowd was mixed. That
Hmm.
group, they're also confused. So not only that, it's not just the leaders you're talking about. It's
Hmm.
the individuals that are there, right? They're thinking about that. So Sadduceic, basically, um, only Torah, no resurrection, because the resurrection isn't overtly covered in the Torah.
Right.
We have Jesus's answer to them, and you go,
Hmm.
well, there's his answer. And then I go, let's talk about it, because do you see resurrection in his answer? And there's a good chance from a Protestant standpoint, if I were to ask you that question, you don't have the answer to that.
Hmm.
So they have this point. Okay, within that framework, um, what's interesting is they record their belief systems, okay, and those thoughts in a library. Okay. Now, unlike Zondervan's bookstore, their library is passed on. We call it the Talmud. Okay.
Hmm.
They are a series of volumes that are, and they're scrolls, and they're literally appended to, right? And they have their dates and things are attached to them. So so you'll have inside this same document Pharisees that don't agree when they're reading a scripture. So yes, they do have interpretive issues that they do talk about. And most of those are driven by daily walk. Most of the stuff is, hey, how does this apply to me and my walk? Because that's
Mhm.
always the question is, how does that work in my daily, my
Mm.
the mitzvahs,
Mhm.
right? What am I going to do good for and to? And how does that look? And me protecting myself from sin, right? Protecting myself from going outside the boundaries
Right.
of what God said to do. What does loving your neighbor look like? And there's a practical example as, hey, if you have a roof, build a border around it so that nobody falls off of it. That's actually in Torah. And you go, okay, that's what it looks like. Caring about your neighbor. What does it look like? Hey, if you if the axe handle flies off, and what do? Is it murder? What do you do? Those are practical elements inside a people's structure. These guys have all lived in there. Dad, you mentioned a point about women not in church, and I don't agree, but by this concept, okay, is that not everybody not everybody that went to synagogue was educated and read. Does that make
Right.
sense? In other words, so
Oh
they
yeah,
listened to the story, men and women. It wasn't like only men read, only men could write. In other ones, there were a lot of men that, depending on their task and worker load, didn't read. Okay, um, but what they didn't get a chance to do was sit down and study, and that's what we see Mary and Rama doing. Is let me. He's saying, let me give you something to do, and they said, let's write it down because Philip's point was write it down, speak it, say it, learn it, live it.
Mhm.
We do this today, right?
Mhm.
Um,
sure.
so it's a point where they're learning and doing. The thing is that women sat on one side of the synagogue and men sat on the other side of the synagogue. Um, in in um, in certain time periods, as you get further down the road, post Jesus, we have some changes.
Yeah.
But at that time, it was split, and you had that. But they were just and they do that during this series. You'll see when you see them in the synagogue. Pay attention. Women are on one side, men are on the other. They're all
Sure.
there, right? And they get to have this point. The thing that they get is, Dad, you mentioned a key word, and that was value,
Mhm.
and that's big. Okay, and that's whatever Jesus did, there was always value involved. But what do we call it? Value added? Is that a phrase we
Mhm.
use? Um, and so we get that, and this is the point that they get to nitpicking and arguing. And like we've said a number of times before this, when Jesus comes walking back after hours and hours and hours of healing, and that I think Dallas brought up a point that we've never had a pastor. I never had a pastor talk about that in the way he portrayed it. Was it? Did we think that Jesus did? He just everybody got a little and they were healed and went on and line them up, but just keep them coming. And yet, when we see the toll it took on him, when
Yeah.
he comes back and he's dirty and he's bloody and
Mhm.
he's exhausted and sweaty and just he's a mess. He's a hot mess. And he staggers over to his tent and his mom happens to be there. And please go back and listen if you haven't, because that episode
Mm.
with her, because there's a point where she mentions he doesn't need me anymore.
Yeah.
And the first thing you see is her get up and be mom
Mhm.
and
And he let
be
her.
mom.
Yeah. He did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He didn't fight it at all.
No, matter of fact, I think
Well,
he embraced it.
I do too.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
way the way Dallas portrayed it, I think he did um, a kick. We have some brutal. So, give me your take on the. We need to wrap this up, but I kind of want to touch because I think it's going to take us some other places down the road. The Matthew and Simon struggle. So, Dad, what do you think of the Matthew Simon struggle? Because we've seen it like blah blah blah. I don't it didn't feel like it's festering per se, but obviously it has been, because we get it in this episode like somebody's wanting to pop an ugly zit. Um, so what do you think?
I think there's a couple of things going on. First of all, Simon is guilty. He tried all these little tricks that didn't work. And who can I blame this on? So that was a reality. And I'm using my own life as an example. I make, mistake, uh, ran a red light. I didn't, but let's say I would, well, that guy behind me was pushing me and I couldn't stop, all
Mm-hmm.
these excuses. And the other thing was Matthew was such an easy target.
Hmm.
He Everything they said about him was true. He said that they pulled him out of Hebrew school and accelerated. What do you say? He graduated when he was 13, out. And he's a target. And so if Peter's trying, or Simon is trying to justify anything or an easy, it's Matthew. And you saw what happened right away. They start choosing sides at the very end.
Oh yeah.
But in
Yeah.
the beginning, right after Simon started talking, Thomas said, I was a legitimate businessman and I could never get ahead because of people like you. So I think you're going to see that when Simon finally realizes, it's going to be a tearjerker when he starts to, not starts to, when he realizes it and apologizes.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's my
Jimmy.
story.
I think what you see in their relationship is literally the um, almost every cultural difference you can think of. You've got white collar versus blue collar. You've got money versus no money. You've got extrovert versus introvert. You've got somebody who stayed in the faith and somebody who walked away from the faith. I mean, you've just got every possible difference these guys have. And I think, Dad, you're right in that eventually, and we know because we know the rest of the story. You get into Acts and you got Peter, and Jesus has him have this dream about this blanket that comes down with all the things you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to eat this stuff or touch this stuff or be around this stuff. And he says, it's okay to touch. It's okay to eat.
Well,
And it
no,
just,
wait. He gets it wrong. Peter gets it wrong.
no, he
Peter
gets
thinks
it
it's about food, and he gets
right.
corrected and says,
Right.
Peter, you're still wrong, meaning
Yes,
in the learning stage. Peter gets it
exactly.
wrong. He said, it's not about food, but let me go. You're the first one to jump that direction. It's
Hmm.
about people. And
Hmm.
that's the generate is that we have our Protestant side of the church skips the next part of the story. And they go with, oh
Mm.
yeah, we can eat everything because that's what it says. It's
No.
not if you finish the story, which we love to do in ours. Now, I would say rabbinically to your question, that'd be the first thing another rabbi would jump on is there's more needs to be done, which is why these guys literally have been studying, their scrolls for millennium, right? And hence how many people have run this back and forth. However, um, but Peter's learning and changing is a key factor. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. I didn't.
And
I
I
didn't mean to
think,
interrupt. I just it was one of those
no, no.
points.
And I think that's what Dallas is leading up to
Yeah,
is it's going to be a paradigm shift.
yeah,
I
Mhm.
think both of them are going to experience a paradigm shift, obviously.
yeah,
But he's building that story for us.
Yeah.
yeah. And because interesting, because Matthew's that can't be happening. Miracles don't happen
Hmm.
because he's very literal. He's got this set up. It's that deal where um, Simon thinks he understands some things, and and who's of value, Dad. You brought the point still goes back to value, right?
Mm-hmm.
Goes back to where who is higher and lower, right? We get this constant argument of theirs is value. It's not in or out. They're
Yeah.
not the kingdom scenario. It's not your inner kingdom or out of the kingdom. It's not. All their discussions are of value, first and last,
Mm-hmm.
right? James and John, who's going to sit in the left hand, the right hand? Who's going to get this? We have these issues. So, yeah, the value paradigm, Dad, is huge, and to again to go back to yes, the wheelchairs did not cause other people to experience the value that they did. However, whether they came back or not, that is that is a lifetime impact event.
Yeah.
You can't be you can't experience having somebody treat you with no value and then somebody comes and says, not only are you of value, but you're so of value that we want to help you integrate into society.
Mm.
You don't forget that. You might not experience its fullness till later in life.
Oh yeah.
Welcome to us, right?
Mm.
But you'll never forget value. Yeah.
Yep.
Guys, this is a big episode. People, please go watch it again. I recommend anybody to watch something more than once because there are too many things that you can talk
Yeah.
about and do. So that's all the fun part. So thanks, and we'll wrap to get to the next episode. But this was fun and
Good.
interesting. The name with just a scripture. I thought that was a kicker. So our point to ponder, believe it or not, for a fun one is the name. The news about him spread through all Syria, and they brought to him all who were ill, those who were suffering with varied diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. And in that healing, it did so many things, but one of them was brought them back into community. It brought them back into value, not only to themselves, but to the rest of society. That's a big thing, folks. And thanks for with us tonight with another wonderful episode of the Sons of the Father on the Dusty Feet.